Our first proper chunk of news for the month is one that I have been keeping a lid on ever since the summer. I was on Lindisfarne the day after this little thing was found, and there was lots of conversation about it. Dave Petts was talking to me about it. I was very excited about it, but I couldn't mention it, even though I was filming this little thing about what was going on at the time, because no one wanted to jump the gun. With the news that a board game piece from the period of the first Viking raid has been found on Lindisfarne, and quite rightly, in that sense, yeah, well, it's one of those weird things where this is an archaeological excavation in many ways and project, which is trying to prove something which everyone takes as fact, but has never really been absolutely tied down in terms of its location. There is a later medieval structure, stone structure, on roughly on the site of where Lindisfarne Monastery probably was. The estate of Lindisfarne covered an awful lot of the island of Lindisfarne, and actually its influence extended out onto the mainland as well. None of this is in dispute, but precisely where it happened, where uh, I don't know, in the Vikings TV series, Ragnar Lothbrok turned up has been has been a matter of loose conjecture for well the best part of 1,000 years, I suppose. Um, and this little piece hasn't necessarily tied us down to a precise location of where the monastery is, but it does mean that the team is getting much closer to their target. Um, it's a small glass globule, I suppose you could say. That's quite a pleasing word, globule, made of blue glass with seams of white running through it. It looks almost like a Napoleon, like a French patisserie thing,
Yeah,
with
and they're
little
sort of
white
almost
blood
like
clippers on top.
the white lines. Sorry, I was just going to say that
Ah,
I'm looking at the picture of it now, and uh, it, it's difficult to all pictures show it, it. It looks very large. In fact, it's actually very small. It's the size of a sort of a sort of a sweet, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. It,
And it actually looks a bit like a sort of posh peppermint or something like that, with these swooshes
yeah.
of
Well,
white against a blue background. And these little globules of five
mm,
globules of white glass
on the
as a
top.
crown around the top.
Well, and
Yeah,
in that sense, the
it's
reason
a very
why
pretty, very attractive thing.
yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose the reason why I mentioned the Napoleon, or I suppose you could also mention maybe a coffee, the way that people sort of will make a pattern, then drag a line through that pattern on top of a coffee, for example, to make that, So you'll see this
Yeah.
in icing on something like a Napoleon, or on a one of those custard flaky things that you get at a patisserie. It's a beautiful effect, and also crucially, actually, this is also very important. It is glassworking at a time when glassworking was relatively incipient in this part of the world as well. So places that actually I'm lucky enough to live very close to Jarrow, just across the river from me, in fact, across the River
Yeah.
Tyne, where they were experimenting fairly early on in melting down Roman glass and laying it out on sand to create small stained glass windows. Now, this, of course, isn't
Fun,
isn't
fun.
monks necessarily, but it could be. So go
No.
on. So
No, I was going to say, funnily enough, and again, I'm no glass expert. I hasten to add, but again, I was at the British Museum yesterday, and looking at some Roman glass from Roman Britain, and there are sort of echoes of some of the techniques in this particular object.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so wherever the influence was coming from, whether it is something that was developed indigenously or whether it's something that was influenced by links that we know of
hmm
to the Mediterranean and to Arab culture, and so on. I guess we'll hear in due course when the research is done and it's
Mm.
fully published. But
Well, have you got the Sketchfab model link there? Because there's actually a 3D model, obviously, that we'll put a link to below, where you can rotate the
oh
piece. You
right,
can
yes.
look at it from underneath as well. There's a small void in there that looks like, well, it's hard to tell, but it looks like it could be simply an air bubble. But actually, my
Yeah.
initial thought was whether or not that was actually deliberately there to anchor the piece, perhaps on a board. I think
Perhaps we should say
one would have to look at it more closely to know that. I think.
absolutely.
Um,
Perhaps we should say it's been associated with a quite well-known Viking board game called, and you'll correct my pronunciation, it's Nefertafel.
Yeah, close enough.
Um, yeah,
Oh, no, not
King's
King's Table.
Table,
No, not King's Table. Actually,
not King's Table,
no. I know the Guardian says
King's.
King's Table. It's actually Fist Table.
Oh,
I've also
okay,
heard some people erroneously say it's knee table, Hanefa, like kind of thing knee, but no, it's uh,
right,
fist table. But basically, the idea is that it describes a series of games, taffel games, table games,
yeah,
where it's played at sort of knee to fist height. That's why it's called fist table. But anyway, so
right.
go on. I'm,
And,
I'm,
and in fact, you can buy copies or versions of this at number of sites. I mean, we've got a copy at home that we got. I think we picked up from a Historic England or English Heritage site some years back. We used to play with the kids,
mhm, mhm.
and but there the pieces are modelled on ivory.
Mm,
It,
mm.
yeah,
Well,
and
loosely kind of like the uh oh
the Lewis chess.
the Lewis, that's it, yes, the Lewis chessman,
Yeah,
yes, exactly, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah, yeah,
um I suppose it's also worthwhile saying that the this also highlights something that I'm often at great pains to point out to people who are looking in particular at for example places like Lindisfarne, uh as they tend to come to these places and presume that they are deliberately isolating themselves from the rest of the population, monks
yeah,
seeking isolation. And in the case of people like, for example, St. Cuthbert, there are smaller islands off Lindisfarne where he absolutely was seeking isolation. Although actually Cuthbert's Island isn't that far from Lindisfarne; it's far enough. But anyway, um, but actually, what this piece highlights is that, in fact, these sites are often in places of great traffic. It was often much easier to trade over long distances via boat than via land. And
yeah.
effectively, they're kind of like a motorway service station. So they're getting high grade materials for example, for making books,
Mm.
information, everyday living resources. And in this case, someone clearly was as well as Dave says, sorry, Dave Pett says, having an elite gaming board, presumably delivered to him.
And you think geographically sort of opposite Lindisfarne on the north coast of Britain is somewhere like Rebay on the coast of Denmark, which is another one of these trading
Hmm.
ports at that
Hmm.
period.
Yeah.
And you have to think of something like the North Sea, really, as you say, as almost the M1 of its time. The main, the fastest north south route if you're trading material.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
No, I think so.
and the thing about yeah, and I think you make a very good point there as well. I mean, one of my big takeaways from this, and it made me think. As you say, we think of Lindisfarne, we think of St Cuthbert, we think of these poor isolated monks who are doing nothing apart from try to, you know, reach an accommodation with God and write beautiful books,
Hmm.
who are then, disturbed by these awful Vikings who, come in, and there's that famous raid which kicks off the Viking invasion period
Hmm. Hmm.
traditionally. But in fact, with an object like this, you're seeing something, as you say, that's a place that is connected and a place actually where people have fun.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah.
people sitting down to maybe have a game on a summer's evening with a flagon or two of mead or whatever. Maybe having a bet. They're enjoying themselves.
Mm.
They're doing human things.
Yeah. Well, and also,
Everyday
well, and also, I suppose on that note as well, it's worthwhile saying that that, for example, the old land route between Lindisfarne and the mainland, as Dave actually points out in a filmed a mini lecture that he did actually in the summer, so that's up on the YouTube channel. As he points out, the mainland route was a slightly different place on the coast, where actually now the road just effectively comes to a stop, because it used to go out on the medieval times to the island. And it really highlights not only people a very human thing of fun and traffic and trade, but also actually commerce, shall we say, the commerce of faith and pilgrimage as well. That can't be overlooked or underestimated. Interesting point as well. I was just checking just in case I was wrong on this grammar because I didn't want to say it out loud and make a fool of myself. But the Old English for king, this is something I didn't have to check, is König. And my favourite
Yeah.
instance of the word kerning is in Beowulf, where it's the idea of that was good kinging, that was being a good king, good kerning. And in Old Norse, one of the words for king is konungur. Um, so very similar to kerning, konungur. So yeah, so the Hnefa
Mhm.
isn't king table. I'm not quite sure where the Guardian got that from, uh, but it also at the same time it is a good shorthand in the same way that I suppose I imagine the board game that you were describing is often sold these days as Viking chess. In fact, I think
Well,
I have a
it is
copy.
trying to block in a king, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
it's trying to block in the king piece.
yeah,
Yeah,
precisely.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
But
trying to.
except you work from all four sides of the square board rather than from side to side as you do in chess.
Yeah. Well, effectively, yeah, effectively, you're trying to stop the king from escaping. He starts in the center, and you're trying to,
Yeah,
and it's been described, or I've
yeah,
heard it described as the, if chess is the beginning of a battle, uh, Nefertafel or most Tafel games are the end of a battle, where the king's side has
right.
lost, they're surrounded, the surrounding the four blocks of surrounding units don't have to have a king on the table because he's just he's now sipping mead of watching this
Yeah,
finish, and the people who
yeah.
have survived in the middle have to just try and get their king out of there to one of the four, well, often one of the four corner points on the board to escape. Um,
The heroic fight against the odds that is so much part of Viking literature and
yeah, yeah.
Anglo-Saxon literature.
Well, and
Something like
also
Battle of Morden.
yeah, well, but also actually, it's also it's also a good tactical game as well. I'd recommend it. It's well worth giving it a
Yeah,
go. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Oh no, absolutely. But yeah, however modern the actual rules are, it's a lot of fun to play.
Good point, actually. Yeah, that's a very good point in terms of how the rules have come down to us. There are stories in some of the sagas. So I know you were trying to wrap it off there, but I could talk about this all day. But there are stories in some of the sagas, um, where people have died over this game. In so much as the problem is this is obviously a time before Monopoly, before there was a box with rules, and so you'd have different size taffel boards. For example, in Dublin, they found boards which are relatively small, if memory serves. Places like York, you have slightly bigger boards. In Scandinavia, they've found various sizes as well. And it's clear that the rules will probably vary, probably from family to family, never mind town to town. So it looks as though, or rather, there are stories of people essentially saying, "You can't do that. You're not allowed to do that," and they're like, "It's perfectly
Well,
legal." So
the
go on.
famous one is Canute, isn't it? Who supposedly stabbed one of his courtiers to death in an argument over a move in chess.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This stuff happens, and also as a related point as well. Last year, I think it was on Bambra. Um, Certainly, last year there was some public conversation about some human remains that were found, where someone had been essentially there was an injury right up through the chest and the head. It looked like just like basically like a sword slash, and where they were placed, they weren't buried. They were effectively dumped outside what was the old Saxon king's court, just dumped in the rubbish pile. So this person may have had a Nefertafel run in, been shut up, sliced up the middle and then chucked outside. It's yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to sit down and challenge someone to a game of Nefertafel unless I'd watched it played a few times. Yeah, it's a dangerous thing.
Just sit and watch and take bets on the outcome. That's much
Yeah.
safer.
Mm.